Tonight we welcome Loretta Redd, a Southern born and raised, but she's lived in California for over 20 years now.
40.
40. It says 20 on some bio.
Give or take a couple of days.
40. Okay.
Give or take.
She has doctorate in psychology. It helps to get into the minds and motivations of her characters. So the people in this book are based on actual history and members of her family, correct?
Correct.
All right. She learned early in childhood that assumptions about truth, whether regarding relationships, business, or politics, are rarely accurate. A former Air Force captain, everyone salutes. Executive coach, political writer, author of Unjust by Coincidence, Dr. Redd melds a lifetime of experience with memories of strong women, imaginative men, and determined youth. I've known Loretta for a few years when we were neighbors at that nonprofit building, and wherever she went, she drew people to her, as you know, as we can tell by the audience here. She just has that power. And I think through her writing, you will see the same thing. So we're really looking forward to Loretta talking about Front Row Rebel. So welcome, Loretta Redd.
Thank you.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. I want to thank Chaucer's, first of all. Bookstores are still and will always be, I hope, the glue of our community. Michael Takeuchi has walked me through this, and with the exception of UPS, we've done a great job. I also want to call out a couple of people tonight. Shelley Lowenkoff. Shelley is a professor and teacher at the Santa Barbara City College Adult Education. It is through him and because of him that this book was written. He teaches memoir classes and picks people up off the ground and makes them feel capable of doing things, and he's a remarkable man who has spurred the imagination of many, many people, and he himself a renowned author. So thank you, Shelley.
Look what I had to work for.
There are my trio of torturers here tonight. Mona Rose, if you would raise your hand wherever you are. Gloria Naya over here, and Lilia Hines. These three people were my writing group. They did not treat me well, but they were honest. And as an aspiring author, that's what you wish for, is for people to give you their truth. And if this is a good book, and I think it is, it's in part because of them. So thank you, you three. And for the other friends, with unending encouragement over the past 7 years. It's been a long journey. This book has been written 3 times. It is based on my grandfather, whose name was Robert Wilby, not Walt Wilby as the character. The first time I tried to chase down my grandfather's actual history, because he was the man behind the man. He was the guy you didn't hear about, but I knew from history that he was something special. So I have with me tonight copies of letters to him from Cecil B. DeMille, from Barney Balaban, from the Warner Brothers, from Alfred Zukor, from the greats that those of us of a certain age will remember, in addition to 2 invitations to the White House from my grandfather. But finding him in history is difficult because he was the man behind the man. He was a very self-effacing gentleman. He was a lovely human being, and he died when I was a child. So the first time I tried to write this, I went through historic documents in New York and in LA and here. There's just not enough about him to make a whole book. The second time, my writing group of trio of torturers kept saying that his wife, Alma, keeps coming forward more than he does. Well, yeah, he's self-effacing. So I tried to write it from Alma's point of view. I didn't like my grandmother. I never liked my grandmother. She's a remarkable character, but it was like, I don't want to write a book about my grandmother. This is an honor to my grandfather. So the third time I took liberty, I changed his name at their recommendation from Robert to Walter, and it freed me up. I have to tell you, writing the honeymoon night of your grandfather and grandmother, not for the faint of heart. This does take a place from roughly 1910 to 1950. And for those of us in the audience who grew up in theaters, whether it be at California or other places, the theater was a remarkable place where you go to live imagination. You're in an audience, you're in a room of sometimes rather opulent room of hundreds, if not thousands of people. And they're all strangers to you, but you're there to watch this silver screen. And once that begins to roll, you completely forget where you are, you forget who you're next to, you forget everything except the story. And that is the power that my grandfather saw in theaters. He was an independent theater owner, which meant that he owned different theaters that were given only small snippets of oftentimes used or already seen motion pictures. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce a few of my characters by reading snippets of the book, and then I'll take some questions. After which, there is, for those of you who are familiar with Harry's, in the back room of Harry's, a place that's familiar to many of us, is a party, and you're all invited. Party's on me. So let's get this done and let's go have a party, shall we? My grandfather would approve of it. I was no taller than a grown man's belt buckle first time I wove through a forest of legs to tuck myself under the ledge at the end of the bar. Safe from projectiles of chewing tobacco and spilled whiskey, I stared at an old sheet stretched between two poles and wondered what the excitement was all about. Dimly illuminated figures finally appeared on the cloth, no different from the photographs on our mantle at home, until they began to move. That was where my dreams began. Dreams that kept me awake at night, dreams that came to life on the simmering screen of my imagination. That is Walt Whitman. Alma, his rather ostentatious and delightful bride, my grandmother, shows up in the book soon thereafter. "How long have you been out here?" I asked. This is Walt speaking. She hopped up and down to stay warm. "Hour or two," she said, teeth chattering. I banged and hollered, but nobody answered. "This is no way to run a picture place," she added. I jerked my chin back at her audacity. "I'll make a note of that," I said. "What can I do for you?" Her sky blue eyes darted through the door. "You can let me inside for a start, then you can give me a job." Somewhat unnerved, I fumbled for my key, barely turned the lock when she slipped inside and disappeared into the dark. I thought she might have been an apparition. I felt for the switch on the wall and waited for the glow from the incandescent lights. A few feet down the hallway, she smoothed the windswept hair that dipped across her bow. "How old are you?" I asked. "Don't see that has any bearing. But, so as you know, I'm just shy a week of my 17th. She paused to take a deep breath, then gushed out an unsolicited list of attributes and talents. I can read, I write legible, and I know my numbers. Mama says I'm headstrong, but I get along with most folks. I'm tall for my age, but always have been. And not that you've asked, but my name's Alma Springle. Every ounce of good judgment implored me to have her return when she was 18, or at least had acquired better manners. Are you always this impertinent? Don't know what that means exactly, she smiled, but yeah, if it helps me get a job, I probably am. Alma Springle was pure, unapologetic defiance. I was smitten. This takes place in a time where independent theater operators were beholden to the Big Five. The Big Five being Paramount, Fox, MGM, a couple of others. And they had three prongs to the stool. They produced and made the films, so they were the producers and directors. They owned, by contract, the stars. Then they distributed, so they owned the distribution rights to all the films that they had made. And they owned the theaters. So if a Fox star signed with Fox Studios, was made by Fox producers, distributed by Fox distributors, and shown in Fox theaters. Same way true with it. It was my grandfather who led the charge to break that apart. So in the early days, this is his description of the Big Five. Fast-changing trends were a boon for the motion picture industry. No longer were patrons content to watch the same films multiple times simply for the delight of the experience. Today's audiences demanded new releases, but they were hard to come by. The Big Five picture producers, Warner Brothers, MGM, Paramount, Fox, and RKO, aka The Trust, controlled distribution. In order for us independent exhibitors to secure a popular feature, we had to purchase an entire package of films sight unseen. They called it block booking. We called it blackmail. I might have messed up here. No, here we are. So my grandfather went on to create this group that was independent theater owners that would have more power when it came to showing films that were, A, they didn't have to pay for as much, and B, they could see ahead of time. So he leads a charge to bring together all the independent theater owners in one place in Chicago. So by 9 o'clock, the room was filled. Young, eager entrepreneurs mixed with men who'd gotten their start in the early days of Nickelodeons. All heads turned as a group of dapper-looking black men entered. I crossed the room, mistaking them for busboys. Damned if they were not only theater exhibitors, they had their own production company in Jacksonville. Alma would undoubtedly have been as shocked as I was, but she would have loved the way they dressed. Mike wrapped the gravel. Mike is Mike Kinsey, my grandfather's cohort. He wrapped the gavel on the table as I took my place in the front of the room with a brief introduction. Welcome to the formation of the National Exhibitors Circuit. We come from all over the country, but we share one goal: fair film distribution and increased profitability for... A string bean of a man pushed his chair back and stood up to challenge me before I could finish my sentence. I'd noticed him earlier. Belt buckle the size of my fist, boots with 2-inch heels so that he towered over the others. We're all on a gall darn fool's errand then, he twanged. I got nigh on to 100 picture houses and the studios still dictate the terms. Go up against them boys and you won't have no flicker less than 2 years old to show. Comments rumbled through the room like distant thunder. Eyes searched for agreement or someone to take on the cowboy. That someone was me. You're right. We can't compete against the trust on our own. The room quieted, but the cowboy remained standing. They own the stars, they make the pictures, they control the distribution, but collectively, we represent thousands of theaters. Without us exhibitors, they can't afford goobers, much less garbos. The room exploded with laughter as the Texan lifted his obnoxiously large Stetson from the middle of the table, tipped the brim, and walked out. Sensing the potential for other defectors, I grabbed Mike's gavel and brought it down with a bang loud enough to pass for gunfire. My wife recently gave birth at home. Nothing scares me anymore. Let's get started. Walter and Alma have a child. And this child does not come into the world easily, nor is she unchallenged in life. My aunt, whose real name was Roberta Bailey Wilby, she is Bailey in the book, suffered from polio. And in the time that passes, she becomes a great fan of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And unbeknownst to my grandfather, took up a sort of a regular correspondence with him. And so my grandfather, grandmother, and Bailey are invited to the White House. So here's Bailey. Bailey refused to join us on the settee. I want to be standing when he comes in, she insisted. She still wore leg braces, and though lighter and smaller than before, they remained sufficiently cumbersome to occasionally throw her off balance. Nonetheless, they offered the one thing I'd prayed for since polio struck: freedom. I jerked to ramrod attention at the unseen voice announced the president's arrival. Alma was slower to rise, eyes wide and mouth half open. Through the doorway swung the lower half of a crutch, followed by black shoes, another crutch. Say hello to the president, Bailey, I prompted. She stared intently, assessing the man before her, not as leader of the free world, but as a fellow member of a select clan of survivors. You're doing very well with your sticks, she said. I call them sticks because my daddy says only a weak person needs a crutch, and you and me aren't weak, are we, Mr. President? Franklin Roosevelt silenced our effusive apologies with a wave of his hand. He looked down at Bailey through milky blue eyes as a toothy smile cracked the veneer of sternness. We are not weak indeed, Miss Bailey, he replied in the same sonorous, reassuring voice we heard regularly on the radio. I shall call them my sticks from now on, he said, then braced his arm on the high-back chair, swung his legs forward, and lowered himself onto the cushion. With the fearless innocence that defined Bailey, she wiggled herself up into the chair next to him. They ignored Alma and me for the most part, chatted like old souls as they swapped intimate insights known only to those who had been ravaged by polio. A mutual love of therapeutic baths prompted her invitation. Warm Springs isn't very far from where we live in Atlanta, she said. Will you come visit? Bailey braced her arms and lifted up, turned left and right to take in the full measure of her surroundings. My house is not nearly as big as yours, she began. But Daddy says it will never fall down or catch fire, so you'll be safe there. Roosevelt blinked hard. I inhaled as deeply as my lungs allowed. Alma pretended to be absorbed by a landscape painting and searched for a hanky. Then a tap on the door provided a welcome distraction for all of us. I stood to offer my seat to the imposingly tall woman dressed in blue crepe with 3 strands of pearls hugging her neckline. She preferred to stand, she said. She rested her hands on the upper edge of the president's chair and surveyed the group. Miss Bailey, the president said, this is our First Lady. Our daughter's forehead wrinkled with confusion. She looked at me, then her mother, before turning her attention back to FDR. Our First Lady, Bailey repeated. Mr. President, how many ladies do you have? All right, so that takes us into the 1940s, obviously. This book carries us through not only World War I, Depression, but World War II as well. And then the advent, as you think back into the development of theater, takes us into the age of the large screen, and something that Alma was intrigued by that perhaps Walter was not so much, and that is the drive-in. So here's a touch about Walt's introduction as he comes back from Europe, working on trying to get theaters restored after World War II to a world that currently has drive-in pictures. I studied the dark cinder block snack bar, an equally unadorned ticket booth serving a stream of imaginary customers. The projection booth stopped me cold. Rather than the heart of the theater, it looked more like an outhouse. Isn't it just fabulous, Bailey swooned. The Veronica, which was the name of this outdoor theater, already under construction. Mike cleared his throat to silence any further disclosure. I searched for a lane of self-inquiry. How many cars can you handle? I asked. Alma replied for him, 360. I did the math. 360 customers, $1 a head, had to be dark to see the screen. That meant only one showing a day. Unless he was charging $20 a carload, it didn't make sense. Where does the sound come from? I asked, certain I'd found an unassailable advantage to indoor theaters. Please don't tell me you're showing silent films. Mike sauntered over to a different wall, tapped a specification sheet for RCA's latest in-car speaker, and pointed to a drawing of a perfectly behaved family of 5 and raptured expressions on their faces. It hangs on a rolled-down window, he said. Individual volume control. I was running out of arguments, or simply exhausted by trial and travel. Hundreds of cars takes a big chunk of land, I said. Given what I saw on my way home today, I'd say property's in pretty short supply. So Alma takes Walt for a little ride. When I was about to ask if we had enough gas to get home, Alma made a sharp turn at a rickety gate with rusted hardware. She bounced across an open field and veered around heaps of dung. The car stopped and shifted into park on a gentle slope as the sun began to disappear. Where the hell are we? I asked. At the drive-in, she replied. She set the handbrake with a sharp pull. Get in the back seat. I missed you. All right, so we have the drive-in. We have the big screen, which then led to, the surround sound and all the things that we take for granted today. And I'll leave you with the advent of another new feature, and that is, by the time I got dressed, the monstrosity occupied half the library wall. I might have reacted better if Alma hadn't relegated my favorite leather chair to a distant corner. It was an RCA entertainment console. So, what does it do? I asked as Bailey pushed me aside and threw herself at the console with a shriek of bug-eyed joy. It does everything, she squealed. Extended her arm along the front, dramatically opening each door with introduction worthy of Oscar night. We have a 12-channel television. Next to that, an AM/FM radio. There are pull-out drawers for 33 and 45 RPM records, plus a phonograph that plays both speeds. All I could see before me was another reason for my customers to stay at home. So, I leave you with that in 1950s and invite you to ask questions, and then we'll go next door and have a damn good party. Anyway.
I'll start it off.
Okay.
How were you able to write about your family and fictionalize?
How was I able
To fictionalize this about your family. Was that a difficult process for you?
You have to fill in the blanks with imagination. Fortunately, my family, at least on his side, were pretty colorful characters. And then interspace that with history. And it has occurred to me as we now watch all of our current movies on something that's this big or that big, that the day of unfortunately, the large screen is probably behind us. And yet, in decades to come, someone will resurrect it and go, "Whoa, look what I found." It's a drive-in movie, or they'll call it something different, and it'll be like, "Oh, wow, we've never seen that before." But the reality is there. I was a little gobsmacked by how much evolution there had been in the process of bringing us imagination, and how honored I am to have had a family that had some connection to bringing that to others. You know, the theater was at one time a palace. You know, they were built to be remarkable things. I grew up in Atlanta. As a child, my grandfather managed and at one time owned the Fox Theater, which had been built as a Yarab temple. And it was a magical place to be. But to me, it was just going to go see Grandpa. But it was a remarkable place. The Arlington here has its own kind of set. The Pantage in LA has its own meaning and background and look. But those opulent, beautiful buildings that hold so much history, you know, are no longer being built. Now it's Cineplex, and, you know. So it's been a remarkable journey for me to look through his eyes at the journey he witnessed, and yet he left the planet in the 50s, and what changes there were after that.
After that, wow.
Talking about the process a bit, knowing you are a highly intelligent, very competent
Are you
person.
running for office?
No, actually, no. I had really great campaign advice, so I didn't have to. And you are writing about your family. How do you, when you talk about, what was the term for your group of three?
The trio of terrorists.
Yeah.
Or torturers.
How do you, as a highly intelligent, very competent, accomplished person, writing about at least your own family, how did you put your ego aside and actually be receptive to the suggestions of the people in your group? What was that process?
That's a wonderful question, John. They kept me humble. There wasn't an ego because I'm not sure that I actually appreciated the life of my grandfather and his evolution through the industry until I began to write this book. And I always knew that, you know, there were certain footholds that I remembered and family stories. We don't know whether they're true or not, that were handed down. But it wasn't difficult, possibly because I started in history and then tried to shift to a different character and then came back to him. This is, the working original title of this book was 40 Years Forgotten. Because he was forgotten in history, and this is a 40-year period of history. My trio of torturers reminded me that no one wants to read about something that was forgotten. It's probably forgotten for a reason. And I, at that point in time, just asked him, once I settled on Walter Welby, don't ask me where that came from, Walt, I said, what do you want your name to be? I mean, what's the title? And Front Row Rebel was it. It was just it. So he is a rebel from the South, and he would have been on the front row.
Red, have you done any look at Hollywood today and how are movie theaters today different from that period of the 50s?
Thank you. It depends on at what point in time the movie theater was created. At one time, the theater was sort of like an operatic. It was an artistic, an elegant environment that was designed to enhance the screen. Today, it's like they want all of that to disappear and only see the screen. And now the screen's not that important. It's you see it on a living room wall. And I tried desperately to find some real positive thing about that. There are so many more films that are available to people. But the environment of elegance, I remember there's a chapter in here of being horrified when they actually brought food into a theater. It's like, oh my God, it's like drinking Coca-Cola and popcorn at the Museum of Art. You just don't do that, but you did. And there's this, can you hear the Coca-Cola bottles rolling down the front of the aisle? And, so the whole environment reflects the culture of the time. And today it's different. Now you get to create your own environment, pause it when you want to, come back to it. But there is still, I believe, a magic to being lost in that room full of strangers, where that thing that's happening on the screen can change your life.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether or not the pandemic has kind of changed a lot of our views. I used to love to go to the movie theater, and after all this time, I really don't miss it.
Well, it started before the pandemic. I'm afraid that we've all, I'm trying to find good in everything. The offerings now are so much greater. So it's almost overwhelming. Like all information for me on the internet's like drinking from a fire hose. You can just type in what your interest is, and there you have 400 things to watch. And that's great. And people can do that, and more people are being discovered, and really good things are being made, and not so great things are being made. But I've just got to let go and let future take care. One more thing. Yes.
You kind of are touching on it right now, but I was wondering, because myself, I think about like the big screen actors from the past. There seemed to be such a few, big screen actors, Jimmy Stewart, people like that, and now it's like there's so many. I don't know if you can comment on that, if your grandfather talked about that much in terms of, I don't know, it's almost like a diluting of the grand, actors and actresses of Hollywood past.
Good question. Part of that is because they were signed to the studios. So if you were, a Hedy Lamarr, you only did films for a certain group, and if you were a fan of Hedy's, you went to that theater and watched those films. That's not true today, which gives opportunity to more people, but it does water down, if you will, that peak person. You know, hopefully that means more home sales for Montecito, but you know, it's just going to be a different world, you know, and maybe the cream will rise to the top as it does with books. You know, there are hundreds of thousands of books written every year, and yet some make it to this table and some don't. Some sell 2 copies and some sell 2 million. So it's a different time, but you don't always, I'm one of the few people that probably still tries to do crossword puzzles, but I can't, you know, it's like, who starred in blah, 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 it's like, I haven't even heard of blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, times are changing. All right, couple of more questions and then let's go party. Miss Lori, part of my trio of torturers.
Well, if your story is about the unknown and bringing it to light, and the unknown person is now known, even though it's fictionalized, maybe you have some other unknown people in the world.
Oh my God, now you see why, now you see why she's one of the torturers.
That have overcome these great, you know, feats, like maybe.
I am not
write
driven to write. There are writers that are natural writers
Okay.
that are illuminated or see an opportunity everywhere they look for a great story. And I'm still waiting for yours, young lady. She is a prior elementary school teacher, lives now in Oxnard, and writes the most incredible bicultural poems and stories you would ever want to read. So Lori and I look for her books and we'll read them. So I don't think there's another book in me. I couldn't put up with the 3 of you again. I'll never say never about anything. But this was 7 years and I want to enjoy, I want to go have a party. Okay, one more question.
One more
then
question.
Then we're done. Anyone else?
I'm going to ask one real quick, just because I have had the privilege of reading the book, and one of the there's so many different aspects of your grandfather's personality, but one of them was fighting the really ingrained Southern racial tension that was happening, and was one of the first people that let blacks into the theaters. And I was wondering why you didn't bring that up tonight, or didn't do a reading of that, or how important do you, because there's so many different things, but with the day and age and where we're living and racial tension still happening in the South and other places.
Thank you so much, because my favorite character in the entire book is someone that I knew intimately, that literally taught me the meaning of love, and that is Annie Mae Jones. And I see, let me stop just for a moment. Eric Larson is my editor and my muse, and a delightful gentleman who is horrified by the fact we have no books here tonight. But the book that you get, which will be coming tomorrow to you, is in great part because of him and the way it's formatted. Now, back to Annie Mae. Thank you, Eric. I grew up in the land of isms, you know, sexism, racism, classism. I experienced it all. What I tried to do was to bring authenticity to the era that the book is written in, but to not be diminishing and to be honest. There is a reality in the South that I grew up in. As a little girl, if a black gentleman was walking towards us on a sidewalk, he would step off and step into the street to let myself and my mother or my grandmother pass. It was unconscious on my part until it became conscious. For my grandfather, it was more conscious than not, I think in great part because of Annie Mae Jones. In the early days of the South, blacks were relegated or invited to take an outdoor stairway to the balcony. And that existed for a period of time until World War II, when black soldiers as well as white soldiers came back from the war and were finally seen as a little more egalitarian in their honor and their dedication. And yet it prevails today in some ways. So trying to write a racial history that is both authentic but also calls out the beauty of the reality of the black culture in the South was very important to me. And I hope you will find that woven throughout the book in a way that both honors those people and also appreciates them for the role they played in his life and in mine. So thank you very much, Catherine. Let's go have a party.
Thank you very much, Loretta.